Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much for joining me and Sally for what was going to be the second of our series. You may recall that Lord Ian Austin, who was to be our first guest last week, unfortunately was ill at the last moment. Ian again sent his apologies, and we will reschedule him either for the end of the series or for a new series some months ahead. So that means that my first guest in this series is Sally Berkovic. I hope you can see both of us side by side. My level of competence with the technology is limited, so I hope you can see us both. Sally is very well known in our community and beyond. She is the CEO of the Rothschild Foundation Hannah Div Europe, a well-regarded author and speaker. Her book, Under My Hat, about the power and struggles of Orthodox women was a hit, and has recently been reprinted in an updated version. Of course, if you use screen blur when you do that,
I know, I should do, yes. The problem is then you see the chaos behind me in the house.
Yeah, yes, it's fine. I've done just the same thing because I'm sitting in my office. So welcome, Sally, and good evening on this kind of cold, early winter evening. And thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to launch straight away into the things we discussed in our kind of preparation meeting. I'm aware of the importance that Chevra Kadisha work, taking responsibility for the needs of those after they've passed away prior to burial, has played in your life. You gave a celebrated, highly personal talk about it at Limud about 8 years ago. In fact, I can plug it. It's available at the JDOV website. And more recently, which led me to think you'd be an excellent interview subject, you've published Death Duties, the Chevra Kadisha Jewish Burial Society, What Being Around the Dead Taught Me About Life. It's not a short title, although it's quite a short book. I found it absolutely gripping. It's extremely unusual and very impactful. So having read it, and I'm very grateful that you drew my attention to it and sent me a PDF copy, which I enjoyed reading, and I've glanced at again in preparation. It's a few months since I read it. Then I thought, well, this is something which is, I think, really relevant to what's been going on. I wanted to choose guests for this series who have a particular insight into the COVID period or to societal and political changes that are going to affect us all. So having now thought a little bit about this book and its impact, which we'll discuss shortly, let me begin with asking you what your motivation was in writing it.
Thanks, Rabbi. If we can take a step back in terms of my motivation, you mentioned the book Under My Hat, which I wrote initially 20 years ago and then reissued a couple of years ago. One of the topics that came up constantly when I spoke to people about the issues in the book was around Kaddish and women's exclusion from saying Kaddish. And I don't want to focus on that now because that we've solved that. And certainly in our shul, people were very welcomed. Women are welcome to say Kaddish. But what it led me to talk about and talk with others is around the grieving process as well. And that led to many other conversations. And as I note in this little booklet, Death Duties, I wanted to explore some of the issues around Kaddish more, but I wanted to explore what it meant to be on the Chevra Kadisha and what grief meant to me and how I had integrated my own grieving process into the life that I lead now. And that was tied in with what sort of legacy do we leave as parents, as individuals, not just as parents, but what legacy do we leave? How do we make our mark? And what have I done for other people that is totally selfless? And we know we talk about, burying the dead as one of those mitzvot that there's no payback. And there was something very gratifying in getting involved in something that was selfless, which in a way has its own altruistic intent in there. So you feel better for doing something that's meant to be selfless. But it was on my 50th birthday, and I wanted to gift myself something. I wanted to feel, okay, now I want to do something with my life. And because death had been a strong motive in my life, if people have read the book, either book that I've written, both my parents died when I was relatively young, both very suddenly. And then I come from a background where my parents were Holocaust survivors. So the talk of death and the talk of making meaning in one's life is I grew up with that, and I'm not afraid of those conversations. And then unfortunately, just over 4 years ago, my brother died, my younger brother died suddenly. So that left, in terms of my core family, that was just me. Fortunately, I've created my own new family, but as my nuclear family, that was it. So I was very conscious of being left alone. And what does that mean as well? Where do you matter? How do you place yourself on what Rebecca Goldstein calls the mattering map, if you've read her book? So I wanted to write this down as my own thoughts, as a legacy as well. I'm sort of obsessed with my own legacy. And it became my lockdown project, really. And I couldn't serve on the Chevra Kadisha during the lockdown because of my own health issues. So people over 70 and those with vulnerable health issues weren't able to act on the Chevra. So I thought, well, instead of doing it, I'll write about it. That was my way of expressing my sense of involvement in the Chevra. Yeah, does that.
It's certainly it's a great introduction, and it goes without saying, for those who have not had a chance to look at this book, it's available from Sally's website, and I will attempt to distribute it. That's Sally's request, but she asked me to do so after this evening rather than immediately before. So if you haven't yet read it, there will be an opportunity. It's very brief, but it's impactful, and the personal reflection, which is very stark and really difficult to put from one's mind, on experiencing one's own Tahara, as imagining one's own death. You've explained, I think, quite starkly why death is in mind, your own background, your parents' sad early passing, and so on, and the passing of your brother a while ago, but why death kind of lurks in the background. But you think very much about your own death and not the death of others, about what it might be like to be a subject of the Tahara, the preparation that you have done so many times for others, but imagining what it would be like to be the subject of the Tahara, and also more broadly, the immediate and perhaps longer term impact on your possible death on your daughters. These are particularly memorable parts for me, and I think when I read it again, I'm sure they're going to jump out at me. But what were the most memorable parts of writing and perhaps rethinking the book for you?
I think that may I read the first paragraph out?
With pleasure. I think people will probably very much appreciate that, yeah. Of course.
I will lie on a cold metal table. A sheet will cover my still naked body. It is a body that no one other than my husband has ever seen. It will be tranquil in the room. 4 holy women of the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, will wash their hands, dry them with paper towels, and pat their splayed palms with talcum powder. This helps to slide on the 2 sets of latex gloves that they will wear. In a quiet murmur, each one will say the designated blessings for the task ahead. No words other than brief instructions will be said, and so will begin the preparations for my burial. A simple pine coffin sits on a raised trolley in the room. It will be filled with some sawdust. Some earth from the land of Israel will be sprinkled on top of the sawdust. If I cannot be taken to the land of my ancestors, at least some of the modern miracle of the Jewish state will sanctify the ground and accompany me wherever I am buried. But that's just the opening few sentences.
I think most people are hoping you were going to carry on.
Oh, I can do if you like. Maybe I'll end it. And what I wanted to do, because I've had the opportunity to participate in Tahara, I've seen exactly what happens. And I've also participated in conversations with women from other Chevrot overseas. And it's been interesting to see what slight variations and different customs in different communities. And I'm sure there have been books written about that. So I know what happens. And I thought, nobody else really knows what happens. You don't talk about it. When I was inducted, so to speak, into the Chevra, and there are women that have been doing this for 30, 40 years, I mean, extraordinary women, I was told this is a secret. You mustn't talk about it. It's very modest, da, 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 da. And I get that. And I get that it's a modest, I'm not blasting it from the rooftops. And for many years, I didn't talk about it. I didn't tell it. I barely told Jonathan what I was doing. And I so that's fine. I didn't do anything about it. Then I talk about this in the little booklet. I had lunch with somebody from the States. So she was a guest somewhere where I was. And she said, oh, at my chevra, we do this. And she was going on and on and on. And I was like, what? She just sort of put it into the conversation. And I was really taken aback. And I said to her, gosh, I'm really interested that you're talking about it, because in London, you just don't do that. We've been very firmly told, you don't tell anybody about it, that you're on it. And she goes, oh, that's ridiculous. How is anybody meant to know about it? Oh, you Brits, you're all so stiff upper lip and all this sort of stuff. And there was a man at the table.
They're failing to note that you're Australian.
Yeah. To them, we're all the same. We're all the same.
Yes, right.
And then there was a man at the table who said, I've never been told to be quiet about from London, but I've never been told to be quiet about it. I do the chevra, it's no big deal. And I thought, so many things went through my mind. One, of course, was the gendered nature of being told to be quiet. Women are told to be quiet, which just fits into the whole pattern, which could be a whole other conversation around how the gendered nature of our behaviours within the religion. But but at the same time, I thought, this woman's got a point. She's right. Why aren't we talking about it? And I thought about that, and that sort of started. I gave this Dove talk that you mentioned about 5 years ago, actually. It was 2015. And I suppose I probably had that lunch around that time, because it was probably why I decided to do the Dove talk. And I thought, this is crazy. I'm going to talk about it. But I hopefully I've done it respectfully. But what I initially wanted to do was...
So for those who are not, certainly, it's very memorable, but it's done in a very respectful and dignified way, which is, I've learned, I know quite a lot about this, but I think that most people, it will demystify it, but in an entirely appropriate way.
Thank you. Thanks. And then I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
No. I did the talk. Oh, yes. And then what I actually wanted to do was not write about myself. I thought it'd be really interesting to write a book about the women of the Chevra Kadisha, about their aspirations, their inspiration, what motivates them, some case studies, some difficult circumstances. I thought that would be almost like a sociological study of women of the Chevra. So I rang the woman who's the head of the Chevra, and I told her what I wanted to do, because I wanted her permission to contact people. And I thought, if I don't have her buy-in, it won't go any further. She was furious. She was, how can you think of doing such a thing? It's private. Of course not. You mustn't do this. I thought, okay. So that conversation wasn't going to go any further. And so I didn't have a contact list. That's the other thing. Even our rota, so I'll talk about the rota in a minute. Someone needs to be muted. So I thought that wasn't going to happen. So then I did the talk at JDove, and I did get a lot of very positive feedback, which was very gratifying. And then it's mulled over my mind for quite a while. I've been very busy at work. I've not had time. And then I wanted to do the update of Under My Hat. And then this Chevra Kadisha book, sort of, as I said, it came out of lockdown really, and not being able to do it physically, that I shifted those energies into writing it. I just say something about the rota. I didn't even have the contact details of everybody. Basically, they put a rota together, and you're on. I do Sundays because I work during the week, and you have you're assigned a number, and your name. And partly that's to save space, but it's also they're not even giving you the name. I know my team members, and when we get there and say hello, but we don't chat. I don't socialize with any of them, not because I don't want to, but we barely know each other, because you really come together for the task. Now, there may be some women listening tonight that are on the Chevra that have been doing it for 30, 40 years and have developed a relationship, and that's lovely, and I'm sure you make friends out of it. But I'm very conscious that it's a task that I personally come to, do the bit, say goodbye, and come home again. I just wanted to mention, so that anonymity is really stressed. So I've been too scared to send the women of the Chevra this booklet, actually, because I just haven't done it. I don't know if any of them have seen it. So I'm
sure that doing a public interview that will then be put on YouTube will also keep it under the radar.
Well, I think the mystique should be in a respectful way, because you've got a recruitment issue. Yes. Who is going to be doing the Chevra? And right. One of the really gratifying things that happened with this was I have a colleague in Switzerland, and she goes, oh, I'm going to show this to someone at the Chevra in Geneva. He really, really liked it. And he said, we have such trouble trying to get people onto the Chevra. He paid for the French translation of the booklet and the printing of it, which I haven't printed. The printing of it, they gave it out Erev Rosh Hashanah, like in their Rosh Hashanah pack. They gave it out to the community in Geneva. And he's had people contact him and say, we'd think of, he's had a dozen calls or so saying, we'll think about joining the Chevra Kadisha. He's thrilled. So it has, I'm delighted, and it's great. So it's been a very nice reaction to it.
Thank you. I was going to ask you a little bit about the translation, but you've kind of covered that. French translation, are there any others in the pipeline?
Someone has a Hebrew one, potentially. Someone's offered some funding for a Hebrew translation.
Okay.
So,
that's, trying to spread it more broadly sounds very worthwhile. So which parts have attracted the most comment from readers?
I think it's the first sort of 4 or 5 pages, which are the description of what happens. And then people have commented, they've said, let me just to put it into context, I grew up in a Holocaust. I didn't know anybody before I was at the age of 20 whose parents were not Holocaust survivors, other than the non-Jewish children I went to school with. I didn't go to a Jewish school, and they had that life. And then I went home to my life. And there were 2 or 3 other Jewish kids at the school, similar situation to me, but it was a non-Jewish state school. So until I was 19, 20, I only knew my whole social life, like Jewish life, was Holocaust survivors. So it's nothing unusual to me. When I moved to London, and it just so happens Jonathan's crowd were not like that, I felt very odd because I couldn't make the sort of jokes I could make in Melbourne. And the sort of reference points were very different. And when people would ask me about my background, I said my parents were Holocaust survivors, I felt like, oh my God, they wanted to touch me. Like I was some sort of totemic symbol. It was a very bizarre, I found London still find some of it quite bizarre, but I found it very difficult to sort of navigate this community that they all felt bad about the Holocaust. And I understand, Hendon Adas has got a community of survivors, and there are people in our community who are in our shul, but as a group, that wasn't the crowd that I met when I first got here. And I still don't have that crowd here. It is very different to my friendship group from my childhood. So when I wrote about that in this, people said, oh, that's so interesting, that's so this. And I'm thinking, it's so not interesting. It's so ordinary. So I find it interesting when people find my experiences interesting, if that makes sense, because to me, they seem so pedestrian. That's one thing, that feedback. And the other is, I think a lot of, you touched on it, and we can talk about it some more, if you like. I think a lot about my children. Everyone thinks about their own children, but my major obsession is dying too young, before I want to be able to help my children when they have children, hopefully if they have their own children, I want to be around for that, because I'm very conscious I didn't have it, and I'm very jealous of people who have had it, and I'm jealous in advance for my children if they don't have it, like upset for my children in advance if they don't have it. So that's something that occupies probably obsessively too much and out of proportion to what it should be, but that's based on my own experience. We all have a shtick, everyone's got a thing they carry on their shoulders, a little pechalak. So my kids don't seem to be bothered at all, but I don't, maybe they're protecting me. The truth is I try not to burden them with that too much. And if you ask me if they've read this, I'll tell you I have no clue.
One suspects that they have. I think that I think the children stalk their parents more than they acknowledge. So
perhaps.
I would imagine. I'm sure if they've read it, they're very proud of it, even though it is, let's say, more than slightly unconventional. So you've covered quite a lot of the themes that I've noted for the next few questions. Has there been any particular pushback? People, you've already mentioned some people have this, whether it's superstition or a sort of a sense that it's undignified to talk about these issues in public at all. Although I agree with you, if people don't know what it is, the likelihood of being able to recruit a new generation of Chevra Kadisha volunteers is greatly reduced. I agree with you. But have there been any other areas people have been particularly, let's say, have found difficult or objected to or remonstrated with you about?
No, I must say, no, I've had only positive feedback. I've had a couple of older people in their 80s say to me, "Oh, you're so morbid, you know, you should be thinking about life, you're so young." Da, da. So that's okay, I am morbid. But no, as opposed to but the focus is not the book, the Under My Hat book, which I had a lot of, "You're so angry, you're so frustrated." And I thought, no, I'm not. It's interesting what people project onto you. But no, fortunately, I've had only positive feedback. But yeah.
It's good. So you already touched on a topic which we spoke about before, and I know is important to you, which is about how contemporary Orthodox communities encourage women to say Kaddish and engage with their grief in the public sphere, which in spaces that have been traditionally male. And, you know, as you've said already, that since perhaps people were thinking about these, well, at least in some communities, and certainly I'm proud that ours is one of those, the issue about women saying Kaddish in the public space, I think is not a current issue, although in many other communities it remains, at best contentious and in some cases invisible. I also know that how Yizka, which is the public memorial prayers which are said for deceased relatives, and in many communities like ours for Holocaust victims, for fallen members of the IDF, and in some cases others on 4 times a year on major Yom Tovim. I know that how this is observed in communities is important to you. It's a time when communities provide the public opportunity for people to remember their loved ones, and also to think about not just their own relatives who aren't there, but destroyed communities. And it may even have emerged from a kind of thinking more broadly about the vicissitudes of Jewish history and what that's meant in terms of who we are and where we're going. Do you have any kind of current thoughts on this?
Yes, I do. And we're drawing on, I don't know the halachot around Yizkor. I suspect there aren't that many. I suspect a lot of it's custom and tradition in different communities. But certainly where I grew up, when your parents were alive, you left the shul. I didn't even know that there were these other additional prayers for the state of Israel, for the soldiers, because as soon as the person leading Yizkor, it wasn't always the rabbi. It was usually, in my community anyway, it was usually an older person who had lost their family, and always a Holocaust survivor. And we kids would all leave, and then we'd come back in later. And that was the model I grew up with, and that's the model I like, I suppose. So at our shul, I know that we stay in for the first bit and then people leave. And I understand wanting to stay in for the first bit. And I'm ambivalent about whether that's right or not only because of the disruption, sort of the logistics. And the reason I like people leaving the synagogue is because I don't feel, again, whether you want to call it superstitions, emotional reaction, it's not necessarily rational, but I feel someone whose parents are alive, they don't deserve to be in that space at that time. This is a sort of sanctified time, a time you can't be empathic unless you've been in that situation. You can try to be, but everyone's grief is different. You obviously can't compare everything, but there's something in my mind and the way I feel that I feel somebody is a voyeur. That's what it is. I was looking for that word. There's something voyeuristic about staying in the room when the Yizkor is being said, if your parents are alive, or if you don't need to be in there. And I feel uncomfortable with that. And I know you and I have had an honest conversation about this, because I have felt that the person leading the Yizkor should be someone who's experienced that. there's, on the other hand, there's the argument that the rabbi of the community should lead that service. And I appreciate there are both sides to it. But as I said, this is my visceral reaction. And I haven't really changed on that. I still feel that way. I understand everybody staying in for the chief rabbis and the soldiers. It's just a logistical thing that it would be better if they left, but I don't know how to get around that one. But yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Thank you. I think people find that very interesting, because there's definitely a trend the other way, in which there's a sense, well, this leaving business, it's all a bit odd and superstitious and unnecessary. And I think to hear a cogent presentation, my children leave Juniska, and not everyone does. We've created an environment where people can if they wish, and I don't really recommend one way or the other, but I think people who are listening will really appreciate a very cogent, I think quite impassioned pitch for the traditional approach, which is definitely the people with it whose parents are still around will not participate. So thank you for that. I want to ask you two more questions about the Tara. One's a very sensitive question, which I think we're just going to flag, which is that it's inevitable, given the kind of growth in people who have chosen to transition from one gender to another, that we're talking, I'm referring specifically to people who have had hormonal or surgical interventions, which mean they are now physically present as a member of the opposite sex. We're not going to use the wrong words, but that's how it is. Clearly, some Jewish communities will find themselves with such members, and there's a whole range of sensitivities that rabbis need to think about how such people will fit into communities, and there's all kinds of questions, some of which are unanswered. Inevitably, eventually, a Tara team will be called upon to prepare such a person for their final journey. And it's not a time to explore, I think, anything in complex detail, but just to flag the fact that this is an issue which will center around sometimes competing sensitivities, sensitivity to the person and how they have chosen to live their life and eventually change, but also sensitivity to the team who will prepare them. And I don't know where, since you flagged this in our conversation, I thought I would at least mention it and see whether you wanted to comment on this point.
No, just that it is sensitive, and it will become if not a reality. I haven't been involved in that, and I suspect there would be a designated team probably created to deal with that situation. It impacts on the family. It's a very sensitive topic, and actually it may well impact on what's written on the tombstone as well.
Yes.
And the wording and how people want to be presented and remembered, and how much choice people have in that. It's a very live topic, and a very will become an increingly I think just raising it and being sensitive to it is important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important we should mention it, even though that we haven't got any kind of brilliant solutions, just to note that the issue is there. The final question about this, before I look into something slightly different, is that, as you mentioned, during the COVID period, for health reasons, and also due to a serious leg injury, you've not been able to participate in the Tara. Can you explain a little bit about how that's impacted you, and how does the prospect of kind of restarting, now that I see you now walking my street, you walk more quickly than I do, and so yes, it would seem to me, thank God, you are recovering. So how does the future look now, the kind of things that are returning?
Right. Well, certainly health wise, I can go back because they've cleared people for that. And then yes, I broke my ankle. Evelyn and I are ankle buddies. Fortunately, mine's a lot better, although I have to be careful because there's quite a lot of physical pressure when you're standing by the table and you have to lift the person. And so actually I have to speak to my physio about that, whether you can put that pressure on your ankle. Sort of but yes, I hope I can go back. I'm planning sort of in the new January, February time, I want to go back. I think they've been a bit understaffed actually, because it was quite because of this recruitment issue, a lot of women are over 70. So over 70s were automatically told not to do it. And then people with health issues couldn't do it. And there's like an emergency WhatsApp group. They're extremely efficient. I mean, administratively so impressive, and asking for people to, if they're available that day, to go and do the tahara. So I think some people have been extremely generous with their time and done a lot more than they would normally be doing. So I hope I can go back sort of January, February time.
So kind of tahara in a kind of a bit of suspended animation is a good segue into aspects of your professional life. You've so far only spoken about your volunteer world, your professional work with the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, which supports Jewish communities in Europe. Now, COVID has impacted on every individual and community in the world, ours included, but in different ways. And smaller communities, and we'll perhaps explore how some of those communities have fared, have perhaps borne a greater weight in terms of the impact. So, for example, based on the subject we've been discussing, the lack of a Chevra Kadisha in some of the smaller communities, simply due to numbers or facilities, how do they manage? What do they do? I think your insight into smaller communities in Europe is probably of great interest to the audience, because you know about stuff that other people don't know.
Right. I think I saw Jonathan Webber on the there he is.
Connie was certainly in contact to say that they were planning to
participate. Right. So I defer to them around Poland specifically. But I think it's very difficult in some communities. There's sort of a roving rabbi in many places. Chabad is around. People sometimes don't know to contact a rabbi. Sometimes people go for cremation because they're not able to, well, because that's what they prefer, but also because they're perhaps not able to contact a rabbi. There won't be the fancy equipment in many places that at Bushy, there's a whole sort of machinery, whereas other places, it may be done the more traditional the old-fashioned way, before equipment, with buckets of water over a body.
As is still done in the rarer case of a home tahara.
Right, today. Right. So you've got to know how much water to measure. I mean, whether the actual taharot that are done in some of the small communities where it's lay people doing their best, you can only say they're doing hopefully I don't want to cast judgment on whether they're halachically correct or not correct. They are certainly doing their best with what resources they have, and the fact that they're making an effort is wonderful. So it's just it is very difficult. It's also not something that's spoken about a lot, and I think, well, basically it relies on the rabbis being willing to travel and to do it, or to give instructions over the phone, I've heard. There's all sorts of, it's a challenge. It's a challenge in a lot of where there isn't an established community. You have a country like Bulgaria, where there's a community in Sofia, and there are actually technically 10 different Jewish communities in Sofia. Now, some of them have 10 people, 20, barely a million. So I'm not actually sure what happens in some of those places. And it may be that the rabbi from Sofia travels out there, but funerals are likely to be delayed because people aren't available, on the spot. So it's different in all sorts of places. But there are many, many, the definition of a small community is also something, it's not for now, but there really are sort of micro communities in many ways, not even small.
So also an opportunity to move specifically from the struggles when someone dies, to ensure that they're cared for in the right way, to think about more generally the impact of COVID on certain sorts of communities. And so while some communities in Europe will be affected in the way that communities in the UK have, others, for example, those to which tourism is central, which is much less the case in the UK. And suddenly, almost overnight, there's no travel, there's no hotels, there are restrictions, social distancing, and all kinds of things that interfere with this. It must have an enormous impact on the community's level of activity and income stream.
Absolutely.
So could you speak a little to that?
Sure, we chatted, yes. So, I can pick two examples, three actually. So Rome, for example, the Jewish community there, those of you who have traveled and seen the ghetto and the Jewish museum and the restaurants, and they've been terribly affected because there's been no tourism and no income coming in. So the community that relies on the tourist dollar, and a lot of Jews in Rome are guides, they're involved in the restaurant, as I said, the catering business. that's had a huge impact on their community. Similarly, in Prague, where the Jewish Museum is a huge revenue source for the community, has impacted the community. And it's not just financially, but it's sort of a sense of international belonging and feeling a part of a bigger Jewish picture. All that's gone when no Jews are coming to visit them, when all the American tourists aren't there, and also just general visitors, not just Jewish visitors, but a sense of a wider belonging to the Jewish world disappears. In Poland, the whole March of the Living phenomena has not happened, which has impacted Polish, I presume the Polish tourism economy, a certain element of it. And in the Auschwitz Memorial, I don't know if how many visitors at all have gone to Auschwitz during this period. Jonathan might be able to tell us. So, I mean, that's less on the community itself, but in terms of engaging with Jewish heritage, that has taken a huge dive during this time. All the like the Tate and the British Museum, all the Jewish museums have been closed. There's nothing special about that, only that they're even in more precarious situations than what they are normally because of the lack of finances. I just want to relate one small story. I was in Budapest last week for work, had a whole series of meetings, and I went to the Jewish Community Centre there, the sort of JW3 equivalent. And I was chatting to the director, and he said it was fascinating. He said, for the last 30 years, after communism fell, a lot of philanthropies, including ours, we funded these organizations where they would have communal seders. I mean, we all know in Ukraine, we partner with Zaporozhye, Chabad or whichever rabbi community does these fabulous Sidorim or Rosh Hashanah celebrations, whatever it is, in the community, with the assumption that nothing will be done at home, so we'll bring everybody to the community. So Marcel, this fellow in Budapest, was saying to me, actually, what COVID has done, it has forced people to have their Seder at home. It has sort of reversed and suddenly sort of this very quick trajectory into enabling people to have Seder at home. So they provided, we know they could have a Haggadah, but he said, most of them won't even know what a Haggadah is, or they won't know how to read it. Certainly not in the very few of them in the Hebrew. Okay, so they've got them in Hungarian, but they won't really know. They will have learned from being in these communal Seders, to have the 4 cups of wine, have the Seder plate. But when you don't have to do it yourself, you don't own it as much. But by actually being forced to do it at home and being given educational resources and encouragement, they did a lot of Zoom stuff on Yom Tov as well, just helping people create Jewish rituals in their home. That's been transformative through COVID. And I thought that was a really fascinating insight, actually, because we take the philanthropic interventions take such pride in, bringing people together, but there's something to be said about enabling Jewish life to take place in the home, within the family context, which is what Judaism is primarily, a large part of what that's about. So that was an interesting impact of COVID moment.
That's something which, in a completely different context about how we operate University of Jewish Chaplaincy, how we operate on campus, that it's quite appealing to invest only in very big events which bring people together and effectively run the event or feed the students. Thus, they just turn up. And while those are really important to create excitement and cohesion, ultimately the goal is to empower people to kind of be Jews without the event, and so while this may be perhaps an unintended consequence, one hopes that it might have, even no one would ever want this to have happened, but what you're describing sounds to me like potentially a good phenomenon that could be developed.
Yeah, it was just very interesting. I think the community stuff, they need a hybrid model of the community and the home.
Yes.
But I just thought it was very interesting.
If you think about it, that's what's normative in real life. Functional communities, people know how to do things at home and have home experience, but they also come together for big leisure events that they couldn't otherwise do.
Right.
I think this really should come. There should be a hybrid. One would hope, but that's a very interesting consequence. So how is Hannah Div working with these communities to try to support them while things like museums are experiencing lower numbers, social distancing, closed restaurants, and so on, i.e. the income stream, but also the bit that I haven't really thought of, that they're losing their sense of positioning in the global Jewish community, because if you're Venice with no tourism is not there.
Absolutely.
That's what Venice is effectively for the Jewish world.
Yeah. Well, Venice itself is an interesting story because there are very few Jews in Venice.
Yeah, that's right.
And what has happened is Chabad have gone to Venice and have set up shop there. And they've got a restaurant there. And people come to Venice and they have the Chabad Jewish experience. They're not having an authentic Venetian Jewish experience. And the hundred or, a couple of hundred Jews who live in Venice, I think it's 400 is the official number of that, are very upset about that because they have been, I was going to say colonized, I'm not sure if that's quite the right word, but they've been usurped. They've been usurped by this Chabad American Jewish experience, and people are and they're not getting the Venetian authentic, because Venetian Jews have their own traditions and stuff, but that's not being maintained.
No, I've been to Venice a couple of times, and that's really quite obvious that there is an attempt, but it's overshadowed by effectively the kind of, by the way the Chabad have excellent infrastructure in place, but it's clearly Chabad, not
yeah. And they're doing a great service for the tourists, but they're not doing a service for the people who live there. But that's a whole other topic. But you asked me about our work, right? So one of the things we do, so generally we support museums, archives, libraries, sort of academic Jewish studies, universities, and Jewish communities. And we have a whole series of programs. But during COVID, Lord Rothschild recognized, and our trustee board are members of the family. So Lord Rothschild, Hannah Rothschild, people you may have seen in the press. And they recognize, they're very kind people, and realized that this was a terrible thing that was going on. And we added, we gave additional money on top of what we usually give for humanitarian aid within Jewish communities. There's another fund, also the same Rothschild family in Israel, called Yad Nadiv, and they also gave additional funds. So we distributed through the Joint Distribution Committee, JDC. They set up a humanitarian fund, which we donated to. We sort of channeled our funds. We work closely in partnership with JDC on this sort of thing. So we gave an additional a large chunk of money to various communities that would go to individuals. So in Rome, for example, in Prague, there was money given to individual families to help them. It was like the same way, in the UK was incredible. I'm sure everybody on this call donated to one or more charities through all these big charity weekend, online charity events, and families were helped, organizations were helped. So it wasn't done at the same scale throughout Europe. There isn't the same philanthropic motivation in many Jewish communities. Volunteering, it's changed, but volunteering isn't part of the ethos, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. There are now many wealthy Jewish people in these countries. Some of them choose to give to the Jewish community, some of them don't, some of them have left. The Ukrainian tycoons have left and are living.
They live down the road.
They don't. Right. Well, what is interesting to see, and I don't want to mention particular countries or people, a tycoon may have made a lot of money in a particular country. That tycoon then wants to give money to the Jewish community in that country. I'm not talking about England, actually, where so they want to give money in that country, not because that country necessarily needs the money or needs as much as they're offering or needs it in the way they want to give it, but it's their way of being. It's not necessarily what we would call strategic philanthropy. It's a business deal. And so you see some wealthy, very generous, wealthy people doing that, but they're not always doing what's in the best interest of the community. They're not asking the communities what they need. They're projecting what they want to give. And look, I'm not saying we don't do some of that as well. We want to do certain things, but we do consult along the way. So so the communities, look, there's a new generation of people. What's also changed, I suppose, last 20 years is the young people speak English, and that has enabled them to be in contact with the outside world. And through the pandemic, I would imagine the older people who weren't able to access the international lectures, couldn't access international social events, who didn't have the English, it makes a big difference. You're feeling even more alienated. So the younger people, it is well, everywhere it's a young person's world, but for the young Jews, and if they're interested in meeting other young Jews, you've got to speak English to be able to go to events. If you want to go to these European, what do you call it? European Union of Jewish Students, their summer university, what they call their summer camps, get-togethers. If you want to access the American organizations that run fellowships for young people, you've got to speak English, and that gives you access to and that also will increase your chance of getting a better job. So I think things will change. Things have changed, obviously, and they're going to continue to change. Yeah.
So that's one of the remaining points, which is that one of the kind of silver linings or positive side for COVID communities is that the huge proliferation of online content is evidenced by the fact that, of course, we were delighted to welcome Connie, if Jonathan's there as well, from Poland, and we have a special relationship with them. But the fact that they can simply press a button in Krakow and are able to join is indicative of what's possible when you see things from communities around the world, and you have internet access, and also you can speak the language.
Well, also, so if I could just, before I forget on that point, across, initially with Central and Eastern Europe, it was mainly, I'll say the word orthodox, but I don't like that word, sort of, I suppose, normative, observant lifestyle. And that was what was introduced as communism fell. What's happened more recently, the progressive movement, not the non-orthodox movements, have gone into most of these countries providing an alternative. And I think that's great. There's more opportunities. That's only been further enhanced by the Zoom and the internet, because you can join any community and you learn that, I mean, all the fuss about, or say women saying Kaddish, that is so foreign in so many other countries in Europe. You've got no idea how foreign that is. Like, it's like mind-blowing in the observant communities, where it's fairly mainstream now in the Orthodox, in the United Synagogue. It's pretty mainstream. It's still like unbelievably radical in many European countries. But that will change over time. This universalism and alternative streams of Jewish practice are entering those countries. Of course, it's a threat to the normative, the dominant group, but it is adding a dynamism to those communities that I think will also keep it going, because they will die otherwise if there's no challenge to the normative, because the young people are just generally not interested in the more observant lifestyle in general. It's very woke. It's the same language of wokeness that you're seeing here and in the States is there with the young people in Europe, in different levels in different countries, but it's all there. And organized religion is not so engaging, and the notion and autonomy, personal autonomy, is paramount, and that doesn't come with a commitment to organized religion. They're at odds. So that's a challenge we're all dealing with, the pursuit of autonomy when it comes to religious practice.
Thank you. So I'm going to just touch on a couple of more points now, then we'll begin, I think, to wind it towards the end. I've already kept everyone for quite some time. That's been really fascinating. We've spoken about the struggles of smaller communities in terms of Chevra Kadisha, but also in terms of keeping themselves running, given the difficulties around tourism, museums, and other areas. And we've also spoken a little bit about the benefits of internet access and the language, broadening the access and opportunities, particularly for those who can speak the language. Here's another issue which I know is important to you. It's something that faces all communities, but I know that it's particularly acute in smaller communities. It's a problem here, but I think is of a completely different dimension in smaller communities in Europe, which is trying to promote Jewish literacy. And
I thought you were going to say Jewish marriage.
It goes together with that. Well, that's the next one, but with the which is that and the difficulty of finding high caliber Jewish studies teachers of whatever way and whatever stripe. It seems to be a kind of perennial and feel like endemic problem.
Yeah.
And so could you comment on how some of the communities in Europe, we think there are problems here, and there are, but I suspect they're an entirely different dimension in other places.
It's a whole other. It's dire. It's really dire. It is so difficult to find good teachers, and Israelis don't do the trick. Sometimes they do, but they leave. They leave. You need people who speak the local language. You're in Finland. You're in Copenhagen. I mean, sometimes look, even in in Germany, where there's 100, 200, depending how you count, there's at least 100,000 Jews in Germany. The school system is very difficult, very poor. You've got a couple of schools in Berlin that are funded very well and are religious, and they take care of themselves, but it's very difficult. I mean, we're involved in an initiative called Educating for Impact, which is involved with 18 different communities around Europe, looking at the schools in those communities and helping the schools improve the level of Jewish studies. And it is so difficult. I don't even know where to start. And yes, whenever I complain about the Jewish education here, and believe me, I've complained a lot, I just I don't know. It's very difficult. So it's not a very good answer. It's a real challenge.
No, but I mean, one of the things your foundation is clearly doing is at least attempting to invest in training and placement and perhaps more creative resources. And
we have a relationship with the National Library of Israel. We've produced multilingual resources. We work with other organizations to produce resources. But you need the good teachers, and you need teachers who will stay, and you need a vision at the top of the school as well, who understands, some places the whole Jewish content for the week is 45 minutes, and that's it. And as for language acquisition, very little Hebrew.
But again, as we've known in this discussion we've had here, is that when it comes down to it, without learning skills, without developing Jewish literacy, there's a limit to how far one's ever going to go in terms of one's real kind of understanding and engagement with a Jewish library and Jewish life. And that's something which I think we struggle with here, but it sounds like it's potentially much worse elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask people if there's a couple of questions. We're not going to go on more than a few minutes, but if there are any questions, please put them in the chat. And then I can have a look at them. There aren't currently any questions in the chat. If you'd like to ask Sally a question, but my final question is that, and you touched on it just before, you thought I was going to ask you about dating. Well, Jewish dating apps, of course, can be used internationally, and one suspects that one of the consequences of not being able to meet people in person during the last 18 months, that people have perhaps find more creative ways to meet online. Is there do you have anything interesting to say about that? Any comments on about how that's going and how it might develop?
I know people are trying. I don't know anyone who's met that way internationally. You do hear of occasional people who meet. Actually, Limud is a great thing for that. And in fact, every year until the last couple of years, we used to bring about 40 people. We paid for about 40 people to come from Europe to Limud. Partly as their own professional development. It's extraordinary for them to come and see 1,000 people and whatever, but partly the motivation was to help them meet other people. And there were a few romances that were started that way, which I'm delighted about. But it's a difficult one. It's difficult. But there are lots of different initiatives. Also we've talked about this between ourselves, people in general are wanting to get married later. And although people are much more mobile now and are willing to travel countries and stuff, but the notion, it's a whole other topic. I haven't seen huge success, unfortunately.
So I think we've covered a very wide range of topics. You've been very open and honest. And I'm just wondering if anyone would like to ask a question. And we don't have to have any questions. I'm sorry about that bipping noise in the background. I'm not sure how to stop that.
It's not me.
And I'll give a moment if there are any questions, but otherwise I'm going to begin to wind up. And thanks, Sally, for an extremely interesting talk. Your honesty, which comes out very clearly in the booklet, has certainly been very engaging this evening, and I'm very grateful for your time. My intention, audience, is to upload this recording, assuming it's worked. Sally, are you okay with me distributing together with the link to the YouTube video with the booklet?
Yes, I'll send you the latest PDF because it's not.
Please just send it. If you send it to me now,
sure.
Then in the next hour or so, when this is ready, I'll get it out.
Sure. Well, thank you, Sarah Hass-Robinson.
Yes,
she's dialed in from New York. That's very impressive.
So I'm going to say good night and thank you very much. Next week, assuming he can be pinned down because he's notorious for this, my very dear friend, Canon Dr. Giles Fraser, who is a very eminent a priest in the Church of England with strong Jewish associations. Some of you may have seen him around with me in various places, a close friend, has agreed to be interviewed, and he'll be our next interviewee. Details to follow. Please join me. And when you see the link, please do send the link from Sally's evening to anyone who you think might want to watch, who wasn't able to join us this evening. Thank you and good night.
Right, thanks.